I introduce Nathalie Bosson. I have known her since a long time in the Coptic congresses that are part of our life. She is now based in Genève University, Università di Ginevra. And but she also had courses in l'école du Musée du Louvre et à l'Institut catholique de Paris. She devoted her career to biblical studies, but also with a strong linguistic approach. In particular, she is one of the main leading scholars for what concerns Coptic dialects, the Coptic Bible, but also Coptic literature. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So, how can we move without pretending to move when everything in the book of Jonah is motion? The verses of Guillaume de Salius-du-Bartas, resting I run, for moving is my cave, and quick I couch within a living grave, are striking, not only because of the oxymorons that punctuate them, but also because these verses in some way sum up the incessant action in action that characterize this parodic dramaturgy of prophecy and the episode of the big fish that history remembers above all else. In the first verse, Sans me bouger, je cours, which serves in part as the title, it is the verb to move that will be the focal point of this presentation. However, I will not be venturing into the field of exegesis or even rhetorical analysis, where there is a plethora of literature, except in Coptology. The more in-depth approach will consist of trying to understand how the translators of the different Coptic versions at the intra and pan-dialectal levels appropriated this text through the choices they made by studying not all the particular features relating to the verbs of motion in the book of Jonah, which would be beyond the scope of this presentation, but those which seem to me to be the most salient and which are likely to influence the content transmitted by the Septuagint, which they translated. Let us begin by saying a few words about the so-called Cantique de Jonas by Du Bartas, a 16th century French writer and poet who was very popular in England in the modern era. His poetic rewriting of the story of Jonah addresses the reader in a poignant and dramatic way and illustrates the diversity of reception of the text, both among Jews and Christians from antiquity onwards, and among writers such as Jules Verne, for whom Jonah expresses the opposite, namely mobilis in mobile, or mobili. Du Bartas' verses are taken from the Suite de la Seconde Semaine, which went through several English translations, the most famous of which was by Joshua Sylvester. Leaving aside the exercise in poetic license and the amusing misunderstanding of the term vif, which in this context means alive and not quick, this translation is interesting for the torment suffered by Jonah in the belly of the big fish, which, according to Olivier Millet, consists in finding oneself neither in the ordinary conditions of life, nor in the state of death, describes a paradoxical state because it is impossible on the material, existential, and cosmic levels. Inactive in his moving, living tomb, while the surface world in the grip of a furious wind is agitated and disordered, it is nevertheless there in the universe of death to which the swelling motions of the surface do not communicate, that the spirit of this fugitive prophet refusing to accept his destiny will come to life. It is in the heart of a sea depicted as an ambivalent space where order and disorder, surface and death reign, that the prophet's forced conversion is played out. While the book of Jonah is characterized by the rich vocabulary of verbs of motion as shown in the handout, it is also attested by three major Coptic dialects, Sahidic, Bohairic, and Achmimic. It thus offers a unique opportunity to study and compare the way in which the Coptic translators rendered this incessant motion of up-down and to-from symbolic transposition of the changes at work among the protagonists of the narrative, and especially in Jonah. To do this, I will begin by briefly analyzing the pair of generic motion verbs book, go, and a, come, in statements expressing the opposite directions of going in, out, up and down. I will then focus on the verb tone, stand up, and its use in phase specification pattern and Hebraistic syntax. I will then conclude with the syntactic construction and foigon, he was running away, which will provide an opportunity to see how Coptic manage the aspectual temporal framework of this expression. Let me begin with three preliminary remarks. Firstly, the study of verbs of motion in Coptic is recent, and few articles have appeared on the subject to date. Most of them focus on the process of auxiliation and syntactic constructions. Secondly, as Coptic is an analytic language, the bare verb cannot explicitly express the concept of ascend, descend, enter, exit, for example, unlike the Greek compound verbs anabaino, katabaino, eseroman, exeromai. Coptic therefore must use of lexical devices by means of directional adverbs. Thirdly, for the sake of simplicity, I will refer mainly to the Sahidic forms of the verbs. Among the verbs of motion, bok, a, and moshe, which are foremost glossed as go, translate the widest range of Greek verbs, eromai, eseromai, exeromai, etc. This list is just a sample of the many ways in which these three verbs are used, each translating several dozen Greek verbs. It is the adverb with which they form a compound that renders the meaning of the Greek verb. Dialectally, a, come, is used in all Coptic dialects, as is moshe, meaning more precisely walk, go on land and water, or water. To book, go in Sahidic, less used in Bohairic, here in parentheses, corresponds she, go in Bohairic, in turn less used in Sahidic. If we had the verbs na and neu, go, with a future meaning, we get the following dialectal distributions on the slide. Although the tandem bok, a, go, come has been the subject of detailed studies, whether of the syntactic patterns in which bok occurs in correlation with its semantic Greek-related motion verb baino, or of the complementary distribution of these two verbs as oppositional pair, I would like to come back very briefly to these two verbs, for it seems to me that Jonah's text showed another interesting feature, one that adds to the conclusions already drawn. That is, when they translate Greek verbs with a goal-directed movements such as enter, exit, implying both a change of location, the figure is moving, and a change of locational relationship in relation to a goal or ground. They differ in the way they take this into account. Verse 1.8 is particularly noteworthy in the two interrogative sentences, and where do you come from, and where are you going? We note, among other features, that not all witnesses translate them in the same way. Two groups stand out. On the one hand, the group which reads, where did you come from, and where do you intend to go? The intentionality being marked using the verb or prefix of the future tense. On the other hand, the group following the Greek text by saying, where do you come from? Omitting the following addition. The translation of the Greek present, like that of the Greek perfect, was problematic for the Coptic. In the first interrogative sentence, we note that the first group rendered the Greek present with a perfective aspect, a past tense in Coptic, expressing an action, an event completed in the past, whereas the second group literally translated the Greek. The use of the past tense is quite unexpected. I first thought that the translator attributed to the Greek present the value of a historical present, which might have a perfective aspect similar to that of the aorist. Hence, this noticeable aspectual difference could be part of a desire to dramatize the episode. But thanks to the presentation of Liana Tronchi, it might be also a textual variant referring to John, age 14. But it's going to be it's too complicated to explain here. I don't have any time. I pass on the horizontal axis. The table, the handout shows that enter or any other verb like approach, leave, expressing a motion towards a goal other than to me or to you, requires the use of book, go, whereas the opposite motion, go out, requires the use of a, come. While the distribution of these two verbs of motion is clear in Jonah, there are exceptions elsewhere. On the vertical axis, on the other hand, the opposition is no longer so clearly marked, as is shown by several examples elsewhere in the minor prophets. And this is, for example, the case in 1:3. The distinction in the conceptualization of the final goal of the motion in cases where the goal is neither I nor you, where a, come is required, deserves further study in order to understand the rules governing their use, unless these rules are only partially motivated. Now, on the difficulties of this text, one of the difficulties of this text is the recurrence of the motion up-down expressed by Greek compound verbs, which Coptic, as we have seen, can only translate by a verbal compound, verb plus adverb. Furthermore, just as Jonah is punctuated by the use of the preposition eis in Greek, so it is punctuated by the compound erai in Coptic, which leads to potential ambiguity that can be clarified by referring to the source text. In fact, the spelling of adverbs meaning up and down is no longer distinguished in Coptic orthography, except in bohairic and acmimic, which have an additional grapheme to differentiate the direction orthographically. In practice, however, the two graphemes are not always used properly, which makes their interpretation unreliable. As a result, in most cases, these adverbs applies to both and up, and down, sorry. It can be linked to the verb, forming a verbal compound expressing the motion up or down, or to the preposition a, e, to, which follows to reinforce its meaning, thus forming a prepositional compound. Let's just take two examples to illustrate the potential ambiguities in Coptic. In 1:2, now go to Nineveh, the great city, the Greek invites us to opt for the prepositional compound, verb plus ria, go towards. It is the acmimic version which, by means of the prepositional compound achun in the direction of, may remove the ambiguity which would remain in the other translations between going up to and going to. In 2:8, the Greek literally says, "And may my prayer come to thee." In the Sahidic and Achmimic versions, the adverb erai can either be linked to the verb or reinforce the preposition sha until translating cross. The Bohairic, by saying go upwards, e epshoi, and may my prayer go upwards toward thee, provides a possible key to the reading although harmonization with the preceding stikos and made a corruption of my life as sent in 2:7, which reads, an albino cannot be excluded. What is at stake in the Coptic text is Jonah's inner ascent, the only possible way out for his salvation through the metaphor of the fish rejecting him. The word imprisoned is freed, and thus the prophetic mission can be fulfilled. In some contexts, the verb tone can have its usual lexical meaning of stand up. Elsewhere, in Hebraistic syntax, it tends towards the syntactic status of an auxiliary, taking on the inchoative value of the Greek verb anistemi. Tone, in the imperative, thus forms a tandem with the following verb, generally of motion, in the conjunctive, that is a subordinate sequential form, or imperative. Common in the Septuagint and the New Testament, this periphrastic construction is also well attested in Coptic literature. This syntactic pattern, which focuses on the motion in progress, is worth noting since it is relatively common in Jonah and has not been the subject of any detailed studies in Coptic either. So I won't skip this. Yeah. And in the two similar stikos, 1:11 and 1:13, because the sea kept continually throwing up waves evermore or rising up against them evermore, we can guess at the difficulty of the Coptic translators who have variously translated this syntagm indicating a continuing process or action, which must have been syntactically obscure to them. Coptic is relatively systematic in rendering Greek tenses into narrative contexts. Thus, while the Greek aorist is almost exclusively rendered by the Coptic past tense, the so-called perfect in Coptic, which is the case throughout Jonah's text, the Greek imperfect is rendered by the Coptic imperfect tense, as is the case here in all the witnesses. Among these different translations, two witnesses, which regularly share several textual variants, translate the syntagm literally. On the one hand, the Sahidic manuscript 193, the Squayange Codex, in 1:11 and 1:13. On the other hand, the witnesses before the Paleo-Bohairic in 1:13 only. In classical Bohairic, B5, on the other hand, the translator has given his text a particular twist in 1:11 by evoking the roar of the sea shouting, a foreshadowing of Jonah's cry to God in verse 2-3, when he has just been swallowed up by the fish. In the before version, on the other hand, we might think that rhetorical reasons led the translator to translate the passage as follows in 1:11. The sea, literally, the sea was about to go rising up even higher. In other words, the sea began to roll and continue to rise more. This expression conveys in a dramatic way the growing and threatening intensity of the swell. Conversely, while the wording is identical in 1:13, the Sahidic Achmimic and classical Bohairic witnesses omit eporoieto. The inchoative aspect of the motion is attenuated and consequently the oppressive nature of storm. Last example. The Coptic, except for witness B5, emphasized in this sentence and this syntagm and foigon, he was fleeing, emphasized the motion of flight through the use of focalizing verbal prefixes. Focalized past tense for one group, for the man knew that he had fled from the face of the Lord. Focalized present tense for the other, for the man knew that he was fleeing from the face of the Lord. The change of aspect with a perfecting for the first group, construing Jonah's flight as completed, and an imperfective for the second, Jonah's flight has not attained his final goal, is significant. Just as is significant, it seems to me, is the use of focalization, which is used nowhere else in the text except in the two questions asked by the sailors, where its use is subordinated to the presence of the interrogative pronoun. The emphasis is on the flight, which thus becomes the pivotal scene between the interrogation of the sailors and the decision they must make, which leads to the consequences we know, and the character trait of Jonah, that of a runaway prophet. Compared with other books of the minor prophets, the book of Jonah, because of its narrative nature, is a text that does not pose any major problems. Overall, the Coptic translation remained relatively faithful to their model, the Septuagint, particularly the classical Bohairic B5 translation of a later date. There are few textual variants between them and the Greek text. Quantitative differences are few, rare. The differences are essentially of qualitative nature, particularly in the interrogation scene. A similar case occurs in 2:7, where the optative expressed by Jonah, "and may the ruin of my life rise," is accurately translated by the group manuscript 193 and B5, B and P4, B5, whereas the side witnesses, with the exception of one, have chosen the verb eine, bring, in the future tense, which more regularly translates anago, bring up. Hence, "and you will bring up my life out of ruin to you." The desire that is not yet fulfilled, formulated by Jonah for God, is contrasted with Jonah's affirmation that God is the actor and guarantor of the inevitable outcome to come. Sometimes the Coptic translator has aimed to offer lexical diversity according to the context. For example, here, the verb anabaino used in verse 2:7. Furthermore, while in 2:6, the abyss surrounds Jonah in both Coptic and Greek, it covers Jonah like a garment in the classical version B5. In fact, where Jonah's head sunk into the cleft of the mountains in 2:6 to 7, it goes down to the depth of the mountains in the Saitic versions, whereas it sinked, immersed in the Bohairic tradition. The choice of the verb oms in Bohairic, connoting the liquid element, has a theological significance here. Moreover, the term oms, which also translates baptisma, baptism, clearly announces this. Finally, in verse 2:6, the Bohairic faithful to the Greek text distinguishes itself from the other Coptic witnesses through lexical choices that are clearly intentional. Thus, the swallowing up expressed by verbs with a strongly Christ-like connotation, pour, like blood of Christ being poured out, hopes, cover, like being clothed in the mantle of Christ, oms, sink, immerse, like the immersion of baptism, is followed by Jonah's rising, prefiguring Christ's resurrection. This study has made it possible to formulate several observations, all of which deserve an in-depth investigation, in some cases using a larger corpus. They have shown that the Coptic translators, far from being slavish, have sometimes inflected the meaning of the text through subtle lexical choices, different tenses, perfective instead of imperfective, future instead of optative, in order to emphasize the dramatic character here, to attenuate or amplify the emotion there, or even to give the text a theological significance. Limited to just a few data, this study would need to be supplemented by an exhaustive rhetorical analysis, which would provide a better understanding of the particularity of this theological tale in the different Coptic versions compared with the Greek model. I thank you for your attention.